I'm Evelyn, and I'm 72 years old. I've lived long enough to see life unfold in ways that sometimes make no sense, and I've learned to brace for the unexpected. But nothing could have prepared me for the day I received a call from my grandson, Alex, the boy I hadn't seen since he was a baby. You see, my son Daniel and his wife Linda had always kept Alex far away from us. It wasn't something they ever explained. After Daniel married Linda, they moved to another state, and communication slowly trickled down to nothing. They were distant and closed off, and over time, we gave up asking questions they refused to answer. It was as though they wanted to erase us, to pretend we didn't exist. The last time I saw Alex, he was only a few months old, wrapped up in a blue blanket with his tiny fingers curling around mine. And then, nothing. For years. I remember that day vividly. The day the phone rang, I was sitting in my rocking chair in the living room, knitting something or other, when I picked up. "Hello?" I said, expecting another telemarketer, or maybe a wrong number. But the voice on the other end was soft, unsure, and it stopped me cold. "Hi, is this Evelyn? This is Alex. I'm your grandson." It took me a moment to respond. My heart started pounding in my chest as though I'd been shocked awake. "Alex?" I whispered, trying to find my breath. "Alex, is that really you?" He hesitated, and then he started to speak. His voice cracked as he told me everything. He told me how his parents, my son and his wife, had thrown him out after high school. How he'd been living in a tent in someone's backyard during the winter. How he was cold, broke, and utterly alone. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I clutched the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, my throat tight with grief and disbelief. How could they do this to him? How could my own son cast his child aside like he meant nothing? "Alex," I said firmly, my voice trembling with emotion, "you listen to me. You are not alone anymore. I don't care what's happened. Your grandfather and I are here for you. You're coming home to us, do you understand?" There was a silence on the other end, as if he couldn't quite believe what I was saying. Finally, he whispered, "Thank you." That night, I told my husband George about the call. He sat in his old recliner, listening carefully as I recounted Alex's words. George has always been a quiet man, steady, dependable, and not one to show his emotions. But I could see the anger in his eyes as I finished. "We'll book his flight tomorrow," he said. "No child should go through something like that, least of all our grandson." The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about what Alex must have endured. I imagined him curled up in that tent, shivering in the cold, and my chest ached with guilt. I knew it wasn't my fault. I hadn't been given the chance to be in his life. But still, the thought that he had suffered alone while we were here, living comfortably, was almost too much to bear. When Alex finally arrived, I felt like I was seeing a ghost. He stepped off the plane with a worn backpack slung over his shoulder and clothes that looked a little too big for his thin frame. He was taller than I expected, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he looked around the airport nervously. For a moment, I just stared at him, tears welling in my eyes, and then he looked up and saw me. "Alex," I whispered, reaching for him as he approached. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly as though I could squeeze all the years we'd lost into that one hug. "Oh, sweetheart, you're home now." He didn't say anything, but I felt him relax in my arms, and I knew he understood. When we brought him back to the house, I noticed how quiet he was. He sat at the kitchen table while I fixed him something to eat, his eyes darting around the room like he wasn't sure if he belonged there. George tried to make conversation, asking him about his interests, his plans, but Alex answered with short, careful words. It broke my heart to see how guarded he was, as though he expected us to turn him away too. "You don't have to worry here, Alex," I told him later that night as I showed him the spare room. "This is your home for as long as you need it. Your family. We love you." He looked at me for a long moment, and I thought I saw tears glimmering in his eyes before he blinked them away. "Thank you," he whispered again, his voice so soft it almost disappeared. I stood outside his door for a moment after he closed it, listening to the sound of him unpacking his few belongings. For the first time in years, I felt like our family had been given a second chance, one I wasn't going to waste. Over the next few weeks, we did everything we could to help Alex find his footing. George helped him get a job at a local hardware store, a small place run by an old friend of ours. Alex didn't have much work experience, but he was eager to learn, and I could see how proud George was every time he came home with stories about how well Alex was doing. I made sure he always had a warm meal waiting for him and a safe place to come home to. It was a small thing, but I could see the way it made a difference. Slowly, Alex began to smile more. He began to trust us, to open up about the things he'd been through. "Why did they do it?" he asked me one night as we sat in the living room. "Why didn't they want me?" I didn't have an answer for him, at least not one that would make sense. I couldn't understand why Daniel and Linda had chosen to shut us out, why they'd been so cold and distant. I couldn't understand how they could throw away someone as kind, as good as Alex. "I don't know, sweetheart," I told him honestly, "but it doesn't matter now. You're here. You're loved. That's what matters." He didn't say anything, but he nodded, and for the first time, I saw a little bit of the weight he carried begin to lift. When Alex first came to live with us, it felt as though I'd been given a chance to make up for all the lost years. I don't know how my son, Daniel, and his wife, Linda, had justified throwing their only child out into the world with nothing, but I was determined to show Alex what family truly meant. The early days weren't easy. He was quiet, withdrawn, and skittish, as though he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I could see it in the way he sat stiffly at the dinner table, his fork hesitating over his plate like he didn't want to take more than his share. I saw it when he carefully folded his clothes, his few belongings neatly packed into a corner of the room, as though he expected to be told to leave at any moment. George and I gave him space. We didn't press him to open up, didn't ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. I spent my days doing the little things I could to show him he was safe, cooking warm meals, sewing patches onto his worn jeans, leaving small treats in his room like a piece of chocolate or a new pair of socks. I wanted him to know he was seen. But healing takes time, and Alex had been carrying his pain for so long that it had become a part of him. One night, I heard him moving around in his room well past midnight. When I peeked in, I found him sitting on the floor with his head in his hands, silent tears slipping down his face. My heart broke at the sight, but I knew better than to rush in and try to fix it. So, I sat down beside him without a word. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I don't get it," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did I do to make them hate me?" I didn't know how to answer. There was no logic to the cruelty his parents had shown. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "it wasn't about you. Sometimes people can't love the way they're supposed to. That doesn't mean you did anything wrong." He didn't look up, but his shoulders shook, and I reached out to rub his back like I used to do with Daniel when he was little. "You're safe now, Alex," I whispered. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." As the weeks turned into months, I watched Alex start to come back to life. George helped him settle into his job at the hardware store, and I could tell how much it meant to Alex to feel useful. He wasn't afraid of hard work, that much was clear. He showed up every day, early and eager, and came home with stories about customers he'd helped or tools he'd learned to use. One day, George came home grinning. "You should have seen Alex today," he told me, his voice full of pride. "The manager said he's the hardest worker they've got. The kid's got a real knack for this." I beamed at the news. I knew he would. Still, Alex wasn't without his struggles. Money was tight, and he worried constantly about being a burden. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table staring at a stack of bills, ones he'd insisted on taking on himself. You don't have to do this alone, you know, I said, sitting down beside him. He shook his head. I can't let you and Grandpa carry me forever. I have to figure this out. I put my hand over his. You're doing fine, Alex. Better than fine. But there's no shame in letting people help you when you need it. He didn't answer, but I could see the weight of his pride. It was something his parents had instilled in him, no doubt. This belief that he had to earn his worth. We encouraged Alex to think about going back to school, and while he was hesitant at first, the idea grew on him. I can't afford it, he argued when we first brought it up. You don't need to worry about that, George said firmly. Community college isn't as expensive as you think and will help you. It's an investment, son. It took some convincing, but eventually, Alex agreed to give it a try. Watching him register for classes was one of the proudest moments of my life. He was nervous, of course. His hands shook as he filled out the paperwork, and I saw that familiar flicker of doubt in his eyes. But he did it. The first day of school, I packed him a lunch, something I hadn't done in years, and tucked a note inside that read, "We believe in you. Love, Grandma." When he got home that evening, he handed me the empty lunch bag and muttered, "Thanks, Grandma," before disappearing into his room. It wasn't much, but I knew it meant something. During this time, I thought often about Daniel and Linda. I couldn't understand them. Couldn't understand how they could abandon their own child and never look back. George tried to bring it up with me one night as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "Do you think they'll ever reach out?" he asked, his voice quiet. I sighed, shaking my head. If they cared, they would have reached out already. Alex deserves better than their excuses. I was angry with them, angrier than I'd ever been in my life. It wasn't just what they'd done to Alex. It was what they'd taken from all of us. They'd robbed us of years we could have spent together, stolen moments we could never get back. And for what? Pride. Shame? I couldn't wrap my head around it. But as angry as I was, I knew it wasn't about me. This was Alex's burden, and he was the one who had to decide what to do with it. The years passed faster than I realized, and Alex grew into a man I couldn't have been prouder of. He earned his associate's degree, secured a stable job, and eventually, he saved enough money to buy the house George and I had lived in for most of our lives. It felt like everything had come full circle. A chance for Alex to build his own future in a place where he felt loved and safe. When we packed up to move to Arizona, I felt a lump in my throat as I hugged him goodbye. "This house is yours now," I told him. "Make it a home, Alex. Fill it with love." He smiled, a real smile this time, and I saw the boy I'd met at the airport all those years ago, the one who had finally learned to believe in himself. "Thank you, Grandma," he said. As George and I drove away, I looked out the window one last time. Alex stood on the porch, waving as we disappeared down the road. I whispered a prayer, asking God to watch over him and keep him strong. He had come so far, and I knew in my heart that he was going to be okay. I hadn't thought about Daniel and Linda in years. After George and I moved to Arizona to escape the winter cold, life became quieter, simpler. We stayed in touch with Alex often. He called every Sunday like clockwork, updating us on his job, his friends, and how things were going with the house. "You wouldn't recognize it, Grandma," he told me one day. "I fixed up the floors and painted the walls. It finally feels like mine." I could hear the pride in his voice, and it warmed my heart. "We always knew you'd make it a home, sweetheart," I said. He was doing well for himself, better than anyone could have expected after everything he'd been through. He didn't need us to hold his hand anymore, and I was proud of that. But I'm still worried. I think it's just what grandmothers do. I'd lie awake some nights, wondering if Alex ever felt the weight of loneliness in that big, quiet house. I knew he'd always been careful about letting people in, afraid of getting hurt again. And I wished he'd find someone who could bring him joy. Then, one Sunday afternoon, he called with a different tone in his voice. Tense, strained. "Grandma," he said, and I could hear him trying to stay calm. You're not going to believe what just happened." "What is it, Alex?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "My parents," he said slowly. "They're here, living in my house." I thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "They broke in while I was gone for work," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "When I got home, they were just there, acting like it was no big deal. They brought that old van from their business and parked it right in the yard." I gripped the phone tighter. "How did they get in?" "I must have left a window unlocked," he muttered bitterly. "And they made copies of my house keys. Now they're telling me they have squatters' rights and the cops won't do anything about it." I felt my heart pounding in my chest. "This is your house, Alex. You have every right to ask them to leave." "I tried," he said. "They won't listen. They're acting like they still own the place, like I owe them something." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" "Yeah," Alex replied. "I'll have to file for eviction, but it's going to take months because of all the delays with the courts right now. Until then, I'm stuck with them." I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. I wanted to tell him everything would be okay, that this would pass, but I couldn't. This wasn't a problem I could fix with a warm hug or a few reassuring words. Over the next few weeks, I called Alex often to check on him. He kept me updated on everything, but every conversation left me angrier than the last. "They're making my life miserable, Grandma," he said during one call. "Dad's barely here. He's working as a delivery driver of all things. But Mom, she's another story." "What's she doing?" I asked cautiously. "She's acting like it's her house," Alex said bitterly. "She rearranged my living room without asking, kept telling me that the master bedroom should be hers and Dad's because they deserve it more. She even tried guilt-tripping me into giving them my guest room bed." I nearly dropped the phone. "The nerve of her." "Oh, it gets worse," he said, laughing humorlessly. "When I asked them to help with bills since they're staying here, they threw it back in my face. They said I owe them for raising me for 18 years. Can you believe that?" My hands shook as I gripped the phone. I felt the same anger I had years ago when Daniel and Linda abandoned Alex. But this time, it was worse. How could they look their own son in the face and demand something so outrageous? After everything they'd put him through, "Sweetheart, don't let them get to you," I said softly. "This will pass. The courts will take your side." "I hope so," Alex sighed. "I can't live like this, Grandma. I don't even feel like it's my house anymore." The months dragged on, and I could hear the toll it was taking on Alex. He was working long hours, spending as little time at home as possible to avoid his parents. They, meanwhile, acted as though nothing was wrong. Linda played the victim, painting Alex as ungrateful whenever he confronted them. "They're trying to guilt me into backing down," Alex told me. "Mom cries about how they have nowhere else to go, but I know it's all an act." He was right. I knew Linda well enough to know how manipulative she could be. Then, one day, Alex called with some good news. "I finally got a court date, Grandma," he said. "It's a few weeks from now, but it's happening." "Oh, thank God," I said, relief flooding me. "You hang in there, Alex. You've come too far to let them win." "I won't let them," he promised. "They don't get to take this from me." The day of the hearing finally came, and I waited anxiously for Alex to call afterward. When he did, I could tell from his voice that it had gone well. "The judge ordered them to leave within 30 days, he said, sounding both relieved and exhausted. "They fought it, of course. Mom even tried crying in court, but it didn't work." "What did you say to them afterward?" I asked. "Nothing," he replied. "I just told them it's over. They have no right to be in my house anymore." He paused, and I could almost hear him shaking his head on the other end. "They still tried to make me feel guilty, though. Mom said I'll regret kicking out my own flesh and blood." I felt my blood boil. "And what did you say to that?" "I told her they stopped being my parents a long time ago." There was a silence on the line after that, and when Alex spoke again, his voice was softer. "I don't know if I'll ever understand them, Grandma. How do you treat your own child like this? I didn't have an answer for him. Sometimes people aren't who we need them to be, I said quietly. But you're better than they ever were, Alex. Don't forget that. Over the next month, Alex counted down the days until his parents were gone. He told me he'd marked the date on the calendar with a big red circle, March 2nd. They're dragging their feet, he said as the deadline approached. Mom's still trying to redecorate my house, and Dad spends all his time on the road. I don't think they're even looking for a new place. But when March the 2nd finally arrived, they had no choice but to leave. Alex called me that evening, and for the first time in months I heard peace in his voice. "They're gone, Grandma," he said. "I changed the locks as soon as they left. They're out of my life for good." I let out a shaky breath, tears pricking at my eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Alex," I whispered. "You stood your ground." "It's over now," he said. "I can finally move on." And I knew he would. The day Alex's parents finally left his house, I could hear the relief in his voice. "They're gone, Grandma," he said, as though he still couldn't believe it. I watched the van disappear down the road and I felt free. I smiled through my tears. "That's because you are free, sweetheart." He told me how he'd marked every single day on the calendar, counting down to their departure. March the 2nd had become a milestone, the day he reclaimed not just his house but his peace of mind. "They didn't even pack until the last minute," Alex said. "Mom tried to guilt-trip me one last time while they were loading the van. She gave me these sad looks like I was throwing them to the wolves." "And what did you do?" I asked, curious. "I ignored her," he said simply. "I didn't say anything. I just wanted them gone." I could tell he felt proud of himself, deservedly so. For someone who had spent most of his life carrying guilt that wasn't his, learning to let it go was a victory. Over the next few weeks, Alex started putting his house and his life back together. He'd changed all the locks the night his parents left, and he told me that just having new keys felt like a fresh start. "It's like they never had their hands on this place," he said. But even with his parents gone, the damage they left behind wasn't so easily erased. "They trashed the guest room," Alex told me one evening. "The carpet stained, and they broke the dresser. It's like they wanted to leave a mess just to make a point." I sighed heavily on the other end of the phone. "That's what they do, Alex. People like them don't know how to leave quietly. They want to leave a mark." He didn't answer for a moment. "I'm just glad it's over," he said finally. "I don't care about the carpet. I'll fix it." And I knew he would. That was who Alex had become, a young man who wouldn't let the past define him. One day, about a month later, Alex called with another update, but this time his voice carried a sharper edge. "Grandma, you're not going to believe this," he said. "What is it now?" I asked, bracing myself. "My parents started a new business," he replied bitterly. "Same kind of thing they used to do before, but smaller. I looked it up online, and they're already getting good reviews." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Where did they get the money?" "That's the kicker," Alex said, his voice low. "It's from my mom's inheritance. Turns out my grandfather, her dad, died a few months ago and left her everything." I felt a wave of disbelief. "So they're back on their feet just like that?" "Yep," Alex said bitterly. "They're living in a house my mom inherited, running a new business and acting like nothing happened." It didn't sit right with me, not after everything they'd done to Alex. "They don't deserve it," I muttered, shaking my head. "They don't," Alex agreed. "But I'm done worrying about them. They can live their lives however they want. I just want them out of mine." There was a strength in his voice that hadn't been there before, and it filled me with pride. Alex wasn't letting his parents' success shake him. He'd finally stopped looking back. Still, I knew that watching his parents pick up the pieces of their own lives had stirred something in him. He called me less often for a while, and when we did talk, I could sense his frustration lingering beneath the surface. Sometimes I wonder if they ever think about what they did to me, he admitted one evening. They might, I replied. But even if they do, it doesn't change anything. They made their choices, Alex. You've made yours. I know, he said quietly. It's just, I'll never understand how they can pretend like I don't exist, like they didn't ruin my life. I wanted to tell him that time would heal those wounds, but I knew better. Some scars stay with you forever, no matter how strong you become. What matters is that you're not like them, I said instead. You've proven that over and over again. Over time, Alex found his rhythm again. He threw himself into his work and began fixing up the parts of his house his parents had damaged. He told me about repainting the guest room, replacing the carpet, and organizing the yard they'd left in disarray. I want this house to feel like mine again, he said firmly. And slowly, it did. He began talking about new plans for his future, things I hadn't heard him say in years. I think I might move south eventually, he told me one Sunday afternoon. I hate winter, and I want a fresh start somewhere warmer. I smiled, imagining him finding happiness in a new place. That sounds like a good plan, sweetheart, I said. But don't rush yourself. You've been through enough for now. I know, he said, a soft laugh in his voice. I just like knowing I have options. Hearing him talk about the future gave me hope. For so long, Alex had been stuck in survival mode, barely able to see past his next paycheck. Now, he was finally building something for himself, something real. It was during one of these calls that Alex said something I'll never forget. You know, Grandma, he began, his voice thoughtful. I used to think I'd always feel like a burden to people, like I didn't belong anywhere. But you and Grandpa, you changed that for me. You gave me a home when no one else would. Tears welled in my eyes. We didn't do anything special, Alex. We just loved you. Well, that's more than they ever did, he replied quietly. There it was, the truth he'd finally learned to accept. Alex didn't need his parents' approval anymore. He didn't need their love or validation. He had built his own life, and he knew his worth. That's all that matters, I told him softly. You've come so far, Alex. Don't ever forget that. Watching Alex heal has been the greatest joy of my life. He's not the same scared, broken boy who showed up at our door years ago. He's strong now, stronger than I ever thought possible. And as for Daniel and Linda, I stopped thinking about them a long time ago. They lost something far more valuable than money or success when they turned their backs on Alex. They lost the chance to know the incredible young man he's become. I know Alex still carries some of the pain they left behind, but I also know he's not letting it hold him back. Someday, he told me recently, I'll sell this house and move on. I'll leave all of this behind. You will, I agreed. And wherever you go, you'll carry the love that's been given to you. Because in the end, that's what truly matters. Not the mistakes of the past, but the strength to build something better for yourself. And Alex, my Alex, is proof of just how strong a person can be. Months after Alex finally evicted his parents, things started to feel quieter again. The storm they'd caused had passed, leaving Alex with a house that was truly his and a life he could claim for himself. He was calmer when we spoke now, more grounded, more sure of himself. Still, there were moments when I could tell he was carrying the weight of the past. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, he admitted to me one evening. I kicked my own parents out of my house, Grandma. What kind of person does that? I took a steady breath. The kind of person who had no choice, the kind of person who needed to protect himself. They made me feel so guilty, Alex murmured. They said I owed them for raising me. I think part of me still believes that. His words broke my heart, but I didn't let it show. Raising you wasn't a favor, Alex. It was their responsibility. That's what parents do. You don't owe them for doing the bare minimum. He went quiet on the other end of the phone, and I gave him space to think. Do you think they ever loved me? He finally asked, his voice soft. I sighed. I think they loved you in the only way they knew how, but it wasn't enough. Not for you, not for anyone. You deserved so much more." He didn't respond, but I knew he was listening. Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is that love can be flawed, that it doesn't always come the way we need it to. A few weeks later, Alex told me he'd driven past the small apartment where his parents now lived. "It's a dump," he said bluntly, "the kind of place they would have laughed at when I was younger." "Why'd you go there?" I asked carefully. "I don't know," he admitted. "Curiosity, I guess. I didn't go in. I just sat in my car for a minute and then left." "Did it make you feel better?" He hesitated. "No," he said finally. "It just made me sad. They could have had so much more if they'd been different. If they'd tried?" I heard the regret in his voice, not for himself, but for them. Alex wasn't bitter anymore. He wasn't angry. He was just sad. "That's not on you, sweetheart," I told him. "They made their choices, and you made yours. You can't fix what they broke." It was true. Alex had been forced to let go of the idea that his parents would ever change. He'd stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, for love that they didn't know how to give. It wasn't easy, but he was learning to accept it. One Sunday, as we talked, he surprised me. "I think I'm ready to move on, Grandma," he said. "Not just from them, but from all of this. The house, the memories, everything. I want to start fresh." I felt a pang of sadness, but also pride. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere warmer," he said with a small laugh. "Maybe Arizona, like you and Grandpa. I'm tired of the cold." I smiled. "You've earned a fresh start, Alex. Wherever you go, you'll carry the lessons you've learned and the love that's been given to you." "Thanks, Grandma," he replied softly. "I couldn't have done any of this without you and Grandpa. You saved me." "No, sweetheart," I said gently. "You saved yourself. We just gave you a place to land." Watching Alex grow into the man he is now has been the greatest privilege of my life. He's stronger than his parents ever gave him credit for, and he's braver than he realizes. I don't know if Daniel and Linda will ever understand what they've lost, but it doesn't matter. Alex doesn't need their approval, their validation, or their love to know his worth. He's free now, free to build the life he deserves, and for that, I'm endlessly proud. When Alex finally decided to sell the house, I knew it was the right choice. He called me one afternoon, his voice lighter than I'd heard in years. "I've listed the house, Grandma," he said. "It's time to move on." I smiled, though I felt a twinge of bittersweetness. "And where are you off to?" "Arizona, if everything works out," he replied. "Close enough to visit you and Grandpa, but far enough to start fresh." There it was, a fresh start, something he'd fought so hard to earn. The house had been a symbol of everything Alex had overcome, the pain of abandonment, the battles with his parents, and the years he spent rebuilding his life. But I understood why he wanted to let it go. It was never really the house he wanted. It was what the house had given him. A sense of stability, a chance to heal, a place where he could be himself. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," I told him. "You're leaving the past behind, and that's no small thing." The day Alex left, he sent me a photo of the empty living room, walls freshly painted, floors polished. It didn't look like the house George and I had left him all those years ago. It looked better. "Finished what I started," the text read. I could almost see him standing there, one hand on his hip, looking out at that empty space with pride. It was his now, the closure, the freedom, all of it. A week later, Alex arrived in Arizona. He stayed with us for a while as he searched for his next home, and every evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset together. He looked different, lighter, freer, like someone who had finally let go of the weight he'd carried for so long. "Do you think they'll ever try to find me again?" he asked one evening, his voice quiet. "Maybe," I said honestly. "But it doesn't matter. You know who you are now, Alex. They can't take that from you. He nodded, a faint smile on his face. I guess you're right. As I look at him now, I don't see the broken boy who called us all those years ago. I see a man who has fought to rebuild his life from nothing and come out stronger for it. Life didn't give Alex an easy road, but he walked it anyway, with courage, determination, and a quiet strength that makes me prouder than words can say. Wherever you go, Alex, I tell him often, you'll be just fine. And I believe it with all my heart.